Okay, so now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share my text with you, just in case you do not have your Bibles available. Um, and we're going to be looking at Acts, the 10th chapter. This is where we stopped. Let's go ahead and get that a little larger. All right. And let's see, we need to, all right, I seem to have lost it here. Give me just a sec to get this back. Uh-oh. Okay, we froze up for just a moment there. I do apologize about that. So now let me try to get my text back up here. Okay. I apologize for the technical difficulties here today. Okay. Well, it looks like I'm still having some difficulty here, you all. All right. So I want to go back. So let's look at Acts, the 10th chapter. Now, this is a fairly lengthy chapter. And so we are not going to take a look at all of it. I hope you all had a chance to look at it before you got with us today. But here is what we're looking at here. Acts, the 10th chapter, we're going to start reading at verse 1. In Caesarea, there was a man. Well, let me set this up first. We have two things going on here. So while Luke is telling us what's going on with a Italian cohort leader named Cornelius, we also have something going on simultaneously with Peter. And eventually the two come together. And so we want to see how this plays out and how they actually come together. So this text starts out with Cornelius. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. He stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he answered, Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called two of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him. And after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened, and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, Get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. The voice said to him again a second time, What God has made clean, you must not call profane. This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. The next day he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshiped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only a mortal." And as he talked with them, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask why you sent for me?" Cornelius replied, "4 days ago at this very hour, at 3 o'clock, I was praying in my house when suddenly a man in dazzling clothes stood before me. He said, 'Cornelius, your prayer has been heard and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying in the home of Simon, a tanner by the sea.' Therefore I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. So now all of us are here in the presence of God to listen to all that the Lord has commanded you to say." All right. So now let's see where we are with this text. So we have Cornelius, who has been praying to God and has been asking God to bless him in a specific way. And it doesn't say specifically what it is, but we know that whatever it was, that a man visits Cornelius, and tells him, "God has heard your prayer. Your alms have gone before God, and God is now going to answer. And so send men to Joppa that they may get one Simon named Peter, and he will come to you." All right. So now at the same time, we have Peter, who is hungry, and he's on the rooftop resting, waiting for the food to be finished. He is very hungry, and while he is waiting on the food, he falls into a trance, and he sees this tablecloth that comes down out of heaven, and it's opened up at the four corners, and there are all sorts of wild beasts and animals on this tablecloth. And he hears a voice that says, "Kill and eat." And he says, "No, not so, Lord, because I've never eaten anything profane or unclean." All right. Then the voice comes back and says, "What I have created, do not call it profane or unclean." And so this happens to him 3 times. And then he wakes up from the trance, sees that the 3 men are there, and the Spirit tells him that these 3 men are coming to get you and that you are to go with them. So Peter still can't make sense of the dream. Peter still doesn't know exactly what's going on, but he's following the unction of the Holy Spirit, and so he's going to go with these men. He's going to go with these men to see the centurion. Okay, so now he invites the men in. They stay for the night. He provides hospitality for them. Then they get up and they go the next day. Peter finally gets to Cornelius's house, and he says, "I don't know why I'm here, but I do know this, that I'm Jewish and I'm not allowed to associate. It's unlawful for me to associate with anyone who is not Jewish. Any Gentile, I am not allowed to associate with." All right. But the Holy Spirit told me that nobody that he has created is unclean or profane. All right. And so I've come here, but now can you tell me why I'm here? All right. So what's going to happen here is that he's going to preach to this entire household, and the entire household is not only going to be baptized, but they're also going to receive the Holy Spirit. All right. And so I'm going to encourage you to read the rest of that. And if we do have time, then we'll come back and we'll read verses 34 through the end. But this is what happens, is that Peter preaches the gospel to them, and then he realizes, wait a minute, God is no respecter of persons, that God shows no partiality. Okay. In fact, let's just look at verses 34 and 35. Then Peter again, then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anywhere, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. All right. So now that gets me to what I wanted to talk about today, because there has been a lot of conversation here lately about critical race theory. Many of you have probably never heard of critical race theory until it came up here more recently, since the George Floyd shooting and since the protests, or since the George Floyd murder, and since the protests and so forth. And so there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory being taught in our schools. What I can say is, obviously, it's been 30 years since I've been, since I've been in high school, or since I left high school, and I don't ever remember hearing critical race theory while I was in high school. All right. I can say that I did not learn about critical race theory until I was deep into my days at the Ohio State University, and also at Capital University, and also Trinity Lutheran Seminary. I don't think that critical race theory is being taught as widely as some would have you believe. And that's the unfortunate thing about this, is that we have not changed the way that we have been teaching history to our children in our public schools. And so what that means is that there is a reductionist history that's still being taught. And that reductionist history wants to make sure that we shed the best possible light on the United States as we can. And so that means that a lot of things that should be talked about, that should be brought up in history, the different events and so forth. And when we're talking critical theory, what we're talking about is making sense of it and looking at the underlying causes. All right. And so I want to share with you now a video. And then once we look at that video, then we can come back and we can have some discussion on it, if you will. Oh, jeez. I rebooted my computer before I started this, and I'm still having some technical difficulties, so I do apologize. Now let's see if we can get this going. All right.
Critical race theory is a way. What have you got so far? Unexplained deaths. The other witnesses, nothing.
Oh, wow. All right. Give me just a second here, see if I can get this thing back going.
I have a theory. Anything you can. No. This is Professor Tempest. He's a consultant criminologist. My interest in crime is purely academic. I do not like to get my hands dirty. Yes, what is it? A little odd. I should really do with your hand. I'll certainly give it some thought. Yes, an absolutely forensic eye. Professor T. Watch now on PBS. Way of thinking and teaching about America's past and present by looking at the role of systemic racism, what we've just been discussing. But the very term itself, critical race theory, has become a political flashpoint across the country, especially when it comes to how to teach young people about justice and equity in America. As Amna Nawaz reports for our Race Matters series, the debate over its potential role in school curricula has set off a firestorm that has roiled school districts and state legislatures nationwide.
Next year, Jason Maddox will be a senior here in Loudoun County, Virginia. His favorite subject is history, even though he felt Black history was lacking.
I think there could be some things that happened in history that should have been taught.
In school, did you learn about the Tulsa Massacre?
No.
Did you learn about Juneteenth?
No.
Do you feel like those are things that should be taught as part of your formal
Yes,
education?
definitely.
Jameson's mother, Vanessa, agrees.
This is American history. All of it should be taught in a certain context and also age appropriate.
Maddox, who works as a job recruiter, and her husband raised both their sons in this affluent Northern Virginia suburb over the last 2 decades. Last year, as the national racial reckoning resonated here, Vanessa joined a Facebook group pushing what they see as anti-racism efforts in school.
When I saw the anti-racist parent group, I'm like, okay, I got to be in that.
What spurred you to join that group in the first place? What has that been like?
There is a definite need for a group like this. I like to be surrounded by like-minded, fair-minded, equitable people. You don't have to think like me, you don't have to be like me, but you do have to be anti-racist.
Not everyone in Loudoun County sees it that way.
There were parents that were just sick of it. They were just sick of, constantly being told, if you don't agree with me, then, you're a racist.
Ian Pryor's 2 daughters are in elementary school here. He's a former Trump administration Justice Department spokesman, now leading a group called Fight for Schools, a political action committee pushing back on equity and inclusion measures.
We're not about not teaching history. We're about teaching history in an objective way that is not represented as America is systemically racist.
When you're looking not at individual acts of racism, but the systemic racism that exists within America's educational institutions, what would you suggest be done right now?
So there's a balancing act here of making sure that there's equal opportunity for all, that we're committed to meritocracy, but also that when we are trying to figure out how to deal with any kind of social problems, we do not overstep and overreact.
Parents who agree with Pryor are now part of a growing chorus opposing what's known as critical race theory, or CRT, often a graduate level framework that examines how the legacy of slavery and segregation in America is embedded in legal systems and policies. The thing is, critical race theory isn't being taught here, but that didn't stop dozens of parents from flooding a recent school board meeting to protest it.
The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our school.
I will do everything I possibly can to fight to the bitter end until you prove to me that you are not teaching my children that they are racist just because they're white.
That outrage echoes messaging ricocheting across right-wing media.
Critical race theory is racist. I don't see race theory in our Declaration of Independence.
Much of this can be traced back to a September 2020 directive by then President Trump, instructing agencies to identify and halt funding of anti-bias training for federal employees that suggests, quote, the United States is an inherently racist or evil country. On his first day in office, President Biden used an executive order to revoke the Trump administration's action.
When I hear the talk of critical race theory, I immediately get a signal. It's an alarming system for me because it's a misrepresentation and misuse of the word.
Jalea Lyles Dunn is the Director of Learning for Justice, which offers resources for teachers to create anti-bias learning experiences.
Culturally relevant, anti-racist instruction models needed. We need a classroom set up, so not just instruction, but we also need a space that lets children know you are welcome here. Inclusive education is a space where we all are at the table together. We all hear everyone's story.
The debate over which stories are included and how they're taught has fueled pushback. Critical race theory is now being leveraged as the catch-all phrase by opponents of equity and inclusion efforts in public education. In May, House Republicans denounced it at a Capitol Hill press conference.
Critical race theory is a divisive ideology.
As did former President Trump at the North Carolina GOP convention this month.
The Biden administration is pushing toxic critical race theory and illegal discrimination into our children's schools.
Nationwide, Republican lawmakers are now legislating on the idea. According to EdWeek, as of June 18th, 25 states have introduced bills or taken other steps to restrict education on racism and bias. That includes 5 states, Texas, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, where bills have already been signed into law. Arizona's proposed bias teaching bill could mean a potential $5,000 penalty for teachers. Texas's bill, effective September 1st, says teachers cannot be compelled to discuss current events, and if they do, they must, quote, strive to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference. Some educators, meanwhile, are holding Teach the Truth rallies, fighting what they call unwarranted legislation.
I think we're raising up future voters who will not have a well-rounded perspective on their own community and society.
Valerie Wolfson teaches 8th grade social studies in New Hampshire, where a new bill would prohibit so-called divisive concepts related to sex and race from schools.
Teachers would be under pressure for severe censorship or fear of that public judgment. It's set up for people to report on you.
And you think it could have a chilling effect on what people teach in their classrooms?
Completely.
Back in Loudoun County, we sat down with school superintendent Scott Ziegler.
We have said for months now, we are not teaching critical race theory in our schools. We're not using any type of program to quote unquote indoctrinate or convert our children. Our equity work is all about doing what is best for children.
That equity work was implemented after outside probes found Black and brown students disproportionately disciplined in Loudoun County, facing racial insults and racially motivated violence, and students of color harmed by school practices.
What was decided at that time was we need to endeavor on a program, a systematic program to help our teachers with this, to give them the knowledge and understanding so they can have conversations around race, very open and very honest and sometimes very tough conversations so that they can make our schools better for students.
The district put anti-bias training in place for teachers, the majority of whom are white. That was back in 2019. Ian Pryor's group launched this year in 2021. Superintendent says there is no critical race theory being taught here. Why are you arguing against something that's not being taught?
No one is saying that they're teaching critical race theory in Loudoun County public schools like it's physics or chemistry. It's being implemented through teacher trainings, and that ultimately drips down to how they teach our students. And it's not a subject, but it's a way of viewing the world.
Vanessa Maddox says she and other parents will continue to push for equity in schools and a more inclusive education around American history.
The opposition groups are saying, we don't care if you teach Black history or, other parts that haven't been taught. We just don't want you to say that all white people are evil. That's not what equity states. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that all history should be taught, regardless of race.
The school year in Loudoun County has just ended, but the debate over what next year will look like is far from over. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Amna Navaz in Loudoun County, Virginia.
Okay. All right, so critical race theory is just one of many lenses that can be applied to history, not just here in the United States, but in the world. And it's important that everybody know that this is just one specific lens that looks at the United States and its history from the perspective of race and equity, all right? There are other lenses that we could use. We could use a lens that looks at this from a gender perspective. We can look at it from a political perspective. We can look at our history from an economic perspective. There are so many different lenses. And so the problem is that while we accept some lenses, we don't accept some others. And critical race theory would be one of those lenses that there's so much pushback on, as we should expect as African Americans or as Blacks, because anytime we bring up an issue, there's going to be pushback, and it's going to be much major than, because white supremacy is always going to look at anything Black as being a threat to their freedom, as a threat to their way of life and so forth. And so it is going to drive them to initiate, enact policies and so forth, and push back to the greatest extent that they know how, to keep these types of things from happening. Critical race theory goes beyond just talking about the Tulsa massacre or Red Summer, the summer of 1919. It goes beyond all of that, because it's not just about what happened, but it's about looking at it critically. In other words, how do we process this? What are our thoughts? What were the underlying reasons and causes for this thing? And what do we do with this moving forward? Okay. So it's a much deeper look at history and not just the history itself. The history itself, what we're trying to overcome is we're trying to overcome reductionist history. In other words, what they've done is they have specifically removed parts of history, so that they can guide their narrative on how they want to be viewed by others. And so that's why that word evil keeps coming up with Donald Trump and with so many others. They want to keep that word evil from ever being used in the context of talking about them, because of some of the atrocities, because of some of the heinous things that have happened, in the name of race. So, but critical race theory is not something that's being taught in most, in any schools that I'm aware of. Even if they may read or hear about somebody who was a part of the development of critical race theory. Again, what you heard at the beginning of that article is that critical race theory is really more of a post-secondary and definitely graduate level way of thinking and doing. Okay, so but with that being said, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because we have a Jewish man who it is unlawful for him to have contact with this man Cornelius, who is Italian. All right, but because the Holy Spirit has led him, all right, this is how the Holy Spirit chose to further the movement of the gospel of Jesus Christ, was by Peter interacting with Cornelius and proclaiming the good news to Cornelius and his entire household, who subsequently became baptized and received the Holy Spirit. And that's when Peter had that aha moment. He had that epiphany that said, wait a minute, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, that God shows no partiality. All right. And so what we should be striving for in our churches is to make sure that people feel that there is no partiality when they come into our churches. When they come to our congregation, do we show people the same love and respect, and do we allow them the same dignity as we do anybody else? And that has been an issue at times at Grace, and we have had to address those things, especially with regard to the homeless populations who have, who can still continue to be a part of the community in which we worship. All right. So, but God shows Peter something. God shows Peter how Christians are supposed to look at and interact with other people. All right. That person doesn't have to agree with us. That person does not have to think like we think. That person does not have to look like we look. That person still deserves, if God shows no partiality, then God's people, if we are to truly be the children of God and exhibit the characteristics of Christ, then we must work on making sure that we are equitable in everything that we do without failure and without showing any sort of partiality. All right, so that's what I wanted us to get out of this discussion today, and then start to challenge you on where is your partiality? We all have them. We all have biases, but can you honestly and openly identify your challenges and then begin to work on addressing those? I have only one man in the group and the rest women, but for the two of us men that are in this group, can we look at women the same way as we look at men in terms of their cognition, in terms of their abilities, their capabilities. Can we look? Okay. I love telling this story because things got ugly very quickly. But during boot camp, we have fire training. All of us are tasked when you're on a boat or a ship. And the boats are the smaller ones like the submarines and so forth, and the ships are all the big stuff. But either way, there are on your aircraft carriers, your larger vessels, there are crews that are designated to fight fires. However, because of the danger that fire poses, whomever sees the fire must call for help, but then they must begin to fight that fire on their own or with whomever is around until the fire crew actually gets there. Okay. We don't have time to wait on them to get dressed and get here. We have to fight this thing immediately because fire and flooding are the two biggest threats to any naval vessel. All right. Fire and flooding, and they happen a lot. So we got to be able to contain this thing as quickly as possible. So we're in our fire training and we've got on our fire, our fire suits, our fire gear, and it's a mixed group. So each of us has to take a turn with the lead hose. And lead hose, there's this, it's about a 10-foot, a 10-inch hose, and there's a brass valve, and you crack that valve open, and then you use the little sweeping motion at the base of the fire in order to get the fire under control and put it out. And so we get a young woman who is next up as the lead hosman. And when she gets up there, she does not have the hose. She's not holding the hose the way that she should. And when she cracks the valve open, the amount of pressure that comes out of this hose is just, phenomenal. I mean, we're trying to fight a fire. So this is real. This is not a water hose. All right. She cracks that thing open and the hose gets out of control. Okay. And this hose is just flailing. And so the nozzle hit the instructor in the face. All right. Now the instructor is, blood is, gushing out from his head and everything. So we got people that have to tend to him. All right. Before long, the fire gets out of control. Okay. Now all of us recruits get pushed off the hose, and the instructors have to take over in order to get the fire under control. And then, of course, that just ended our fire training for the day, and everybody got cussed out. I bring that story up, though, because there were some very disparaging things that the instructor said about that young woman. Now, did she make a mistake? Yes, she did. Was it because she was incapable of doing it the right way? That's not the case. Okay. She was very capable. She just didn't do it. And so what's the difference between a woman who screws up during fire training and a man who screws up? Because I'm sure there have been plenty of young men who have messed up that very same test. All right. He said some very disparaging things about women being in the military. And so this was part of that old regime that I'm sure we don't miss. We appreciate their service and everything, but not very forward thinking. Okay. He had a bias against women, and that bias showed. He was just waiting for an example of a woman to mess up, because there were other women who had been on that hose before she got there who were successful. Okay. We have women who are now driving ships. We have women who are flying combatant planes and not just support planes. We have women that are in various combat roles, infantry and so forth. So these things are happening. They are able. I took Azaria. Azaria was thinking about joining the fire department. And so I took her down to the fire academy way down on Parsons Avenue and stayed with her the whole day. But I met tons of women who got through the fire academy successfully. Right? I met tons of police officers who got through the police academy successfully. They're not making any, they're not changing the way, the way that things are taught, and they're not changing the standards because women are doing this. Women are able to go in and still, with the physicality, be just as successful as their male counterparts. All right. So now we also got to look at women. You know, women, do you look at men with some sort of bias? Because there are a lot of women that look toward men with some sort of bias. Okay. You know, some women think that women are just inherently smarter than men. Not saying that there aren't women who are smarter than men. Not saying that there aren't women who are part of the Mensa society and have 140 plus IQ. Lots of women like that. Okay. And I hate that I can't remember the young girl's name who just won the National Spelling Bee a couple of weeks ago. But, you know, she's also a very talented basketball player as well. And so, you know, we need to applaud things like that when we see our young women out here doing the things that they're doing. But just being a woman does not inherently make you smarter than a man. Okay. And just being a man does not make you inherently smarter than women, or stronger than women, or more capable. The roles were just so different for so long, okay, that women did have what we called more domestic roles, while men were the hunters and gatherers. But it's 2021 now. We have to look at things a little bit differently. All right. Then let's talk about race for a minute, because that's what this boiled down to in our text. It was really about race. So now, can you look at white people without partiality? All right. Can you look at a white man? Can you look at a white woman without partiality? Okay. Can we look at our African brothers and sisters that have come here? Can we look at our Latin and Hispanic, Latino and Latina and Hispanic brothers and sisters? Can we look at them without partiality? All right. And my guess is going to be, for some of us, no, we can't look, because of all the things that we've experienced, all the things that we have seen ourselves, all the things. And then we got to look at what's been going on to our, here in our country the last 4 or 5 years, that, for some people, racism is getting worse. For some people, racism isn't any worse. It's just on film now. It's being recorded now. For some people, racism, white supremacy and white supremacists have become more bold. It's not that they're thinking any worse or any differently. They're just being who they are, but they're more bold with it now. So regardless of what the case is, our job is to look at people without partiality. And if you're like me, you're probably gonna be working on it the rest of your life. This is something that I know what my biases are, and I know what I need to work on. And so those are the things that I am doing. A conversation. Let me just say this real quickly: that sitting down and having a conversation with somebody, okay, is very helpful. Okay, sitting down and getting to understand other people's perspectives, even if I don't agree. Okay. Because one of the things that it does is it humanizes, it oftentimes humanizes both sides. But regardless, okay, what we want to work toward and what our goal should be based on what this text is telling us. What if Peter had decided, no, I'm not going, and talk to them and interact with them? They're beneath me, and it's not even legal for me to talk to them. Okay. We're to be different. We're called to be different. We're called to move beyond the barriers and so forth that society struggles with, because we know someone and we are empowered by someone who gives us the ability to overcome the barriers that they can't. And so one of those barriers has to be our biases. We have to make strides to overcome those barriers. Not going to happen in one day. There's a lot that has to be deconstructed. Think about some of the things that, you know, I heard at the barbershop, things that I was taught along the way. I never will forget that my father was at the house this one particular night, and I think I've told you this from the pulpit before, but he put me to bed that night, and before he left the room, I said, you know, I said, Dad, I think I want to be white. I could tell that my dad was not ready for that conversation, and so he went and got my mother and said, tell her what you just told me. And I said, well, I think I want to be white. Well, why would you want to be white? And of course, remember now, Mom is the one that I credit. Besides the Bible, the first book I learned how to read was Black Voices. So Langston Hughes and Nikki Giovanni, and really not Langston Hughes, it was more of the writers from the Black arts movement of the 60s and not necessarily the Harlem Renaissance. But Nikki Giovanni is one of the ones that stands out to me, but there were so many other writers, Angela Davis and so forth, that, and Angela Davis still is one of my favorite writers, even though she writes so critically that sometimes, you know, I need a dictionary in order to, you know, really pull apart what she's saying, but she's a powerful writer, very powerful writer. So anyway, I said, well, white people have all the money, they have all the houses, they have all the land. And so where did I get that from? I got it from the barbershop. I heard those guys at the barbershop. My father had dropped me off at the barbershop and then came and picked me up after I got my hair cut. But in the meantime, I'm listening to these guys go back and forth, and that's where their thinking was, is that white people have all the money, white people have all the houses, white people have all the land. And so I made it up in my mind, this wasn't about color for me. This is about, I don't want to be poor my whole life. I don't want to be broke. And so if I got to be white, you know, not knowing exactly what that meant. So of course, you know, now that I'm older, my thinking has, you know, has definitely changed. But just having to deconstruct some of the things that we heard growing up about men, about women, about race, about culture, about ethnicity, about Democrat versus Republican. There's so many things that we need to deconstruct. We need to realize, first of all, race is a construct in and of itself. God didn't come up with race. Men came up with race. And for the last at least 500 years, a little bit more than 500 years, have used race as a means of being able to separate people, to divide and to conquer. All right. So that's all I have to say for the day, but there may be some comments or some questions out there. And so before we turn this down for the day, I want to pause for just a moment for any comments, any questions, any concerns that may come from the group. Now's your time. Just make sure that you unmute yourself. If you look in the bottom left corner of your screen, you'll see where it says mute. All right. And so you just click on that so that the little red line isn't still going through it, and then you can talk. Okay, now I don't want a whole lot of dead space in here, so if you don't speak up here, then we'll just go ahead and shut it down for the day. But we just, you know, I can't stand that dead space when we're doing this. So please, if you got something, just jump on in there. Okay, so then you all enjoy the rest of your day today. Enjoy the rest of your week. Next week, what we're going to look at, like we had talked about before, we meant to talk about Acts the 10th chapter today. Now we want to see how conflict in the church was dealt with. One of the, not the first conflict, but the first major conflict, because this now not only just impacts the earlier issues that we haven't gotten to yet, were dealt with within it. They were conflicts within a congregation. Now we're dealing with a more of a church community thing. Okay, we're dealing with several churches from different communities that have come that are having difficulty with a particular issue. So we're going to be looking at Acts the 15th chapter next week, and so that's what I would encourage you to read and prepare for next time. So God bless you. May heaven smile upon you.